Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back after your lunch break. Thank you for joining us virtually. I'm very pleased to welcome you to the lunchtime panel on the second day of our Digital on Helix 2021 conference. Before introducing the panel, I would just like to take this opportunity to say it is a privilege to be working on this event with all of my colleagues who I've seen work so hard to make it come together smoothly. And of course, it couldn't be done without the expertise of speakers and sponsors too. I really hope everyone is enjoying the conference so far, reflecting on the content and also using it as an opportunity to connect with others as well. So in this lunchtime panel, sponsored by tranScrip, we are going to be discussing bridging the gap between innovation and patients. This is such an important topic and the foundation for why many choose a career in the life science industry. Patients are at the heart of everything that we do. The focus of this hour-long discussion is going to explore what is most critical for patients during the journey of innovation. So focusing on innovative therapeutic programs, but what things are often forgotten during the journey and how can we make the progress process more patient-centric? I really look forward to hearing the thoughts of the expert panel. And with that, I am now delighted to introduce our moderator for this session, Marcin Mankowski, Managing Partner at tranScrip. So with that, a very warm welcome to Marcin and panelists. Over to you.
Thank you, Alicia, and welcome everyone. My name is Marcin Mankowski. I'm a pharmaceutical physician and one of the managing partners at tranScrip, which is a specialized service provider in drug development, a company based here in the UK. And I have spent the last 25 years developing drugs in different therapy areas, and the last 12 years as part of tranScrip, where we serve a variety of clients, pharma and biotech, across different therapy areas and all the phases of drug development. So I have been exposed myself to the issues surrounding patients and approach to patients and interaction with patients in many different ways. And so I'm really looking forward to this discussion. We've got an excellent group of panelists today who will give us different perspectives on the topic of innovation and the patient. We have people who represent academic research, drug development from a pharmaceutical company point of view, as well as those who focus on patient access and commercial elements. So we have around the table expertise that spans from vaccines to therapeutics and orphan drugs, advanced therapies, children to adults, and different therapy areas. So in order to kick us off, I would like to go to each panelist and ask them for a short summary of what they do in their daily life and how the work that they do every day impacts on patients, how they interact with patients, which lens do they look at patients with. So, Wills, could we start with you?
Excellent. Thank you very much, Marcin, and good afternoon, good morning. Hello, everybody. And thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this extremely interesting panel. I think bridging the gap between innovation and the patient is a really excellent topic to be discussing, because obviously our objective is not just to do great development, but also to secure that that development ends up in the hands of the patients. So my name's Hughes-Wilson. I'm Chief Commercial Planning and Access at Mereo BioPharma, based in London. And we'll be speaking from my perspective, particularly from the perspective of orphan drugs and rare diseases. We're about to go into phase 3 development with one of our rare disease programs in osteogenesis imperfecta, brittle bone disease. And we're also just finishing up a phase 2 trial in another rare lung disease, alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency. So obviously from a rare disease perspective, engaging with the patients, as all the speakers will have, is a very specific approach. It's a specialized field. It gives specific opportunities to engage with the patients and the patient community. And that also creates some challenges that are very specific to the field. Many genetic conditions manifest in children and then can go on to require treatment on a lifelong basis. So that means from a pharma company development perspective, we're talking about a long-term engagement. And we believe it's important to start as you mean to go on. So start early and do that. The second element, I believe, that's particular to rare diseases is that very often the expertise is scarce and scattered, especially if there's no existing treatment. And very often then it's the actual people with the condition that are the real experts. And so it's actually really critical to bring them into the process so that they're really educating us as a company, but also informing the regulators, even the treating physicians, the HTAs and the payers. And in order to address this at Mereo, we take a very structured, systematic approach. So for example, patient representatives are invited to all of our regulatory interactions and have done since the very beginning. We regularly have people with the conditions that we're seeking to treat come to speak to the whole company so that finance, reception, legal, everybody is understanding the patient perspective and it's not just a lucky few. And I think this is absolutely critical because what we're talking about here is innovation. And an innovation is something that is applied to create value to a problem or a process or a situation. And we can only understand what that value is, that added value, if we're really talking to the end user. And that, of course, for us is the patient community. So I'll stop there. Thank you, Marcin.
Thank you very much. Gilbert, can I hand over to you?
Yes, please. First of all, Marcin, I would like to thank you for inviting me to this very interesting panel. My name is Gilbert Wagner. I'm the Chief Medical Officer of Ixaka, a privately held cell and gene therapy company based in London, UK. We have a cell therapy product in phase 3 in critical limb-threatening ischemia, admittedly not a rare disease, an orphan disease, and an in vivo CAR T, in vivo gene therapy in preclinical development. I'm a German native physician by training with a PhD in epidemiology and public health from Erasmus University in Rotterdam. I have roughly 25 years experience in global drug development, and I spent the last 15 years with ATMPs, cell and gene therapy, antisense oligonucleotides with MAA and BLA. I have developed drugs, particularly in early stages, proof of concept in orphan diseases, in autoimmune disease and cardiometabolic disease. And I've also conducted large randomized controlled clinical trials. And I appreciate the introduction of Wills because, yes, there is a difference between the large indications, cardiometabolic, where you normally generate a database. You rarely have contact, I would say, except for the multiple sclerosis community, which has a very special aspect in terms of their representation in patient organizations. But yes, it is extremely important to understand the patient's perspective. And I think there has been huge progress over the last 10 to 15 years. Patient-reported outcomes are instrumental to the developing an MAA or a BLA or any kind of submission. In early stage, I think science is more in the focus with very well-known diseases. In late stage, as I said, the PROs as an instrument is well accepted and has fully established. I think a point which is probably outstanding is the identification of benefit, because here we have to balance the public health perspective on the one hand side and the individual benefit for patients. I think that's something where we may come up in the discussion. And the other point I have, when I reviewed the topic, I've realized is there is basically no participation of patients in the selection of the indication. So whenever we have an idea to develop a new drug in an indication, that's a sole decision by a sponsor, by pharmaceutical industry. But I haven't really seen any initiative that takes up and says we need to get funding for a an indication where we think the medical need is high. Is every company that is developing a drug thinks it's the highest medical need, and it's also focused on the patient and the patient's benefit. But I would really like to understand why, except for the funding issue, there is so little activity in this field. So I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you again, Marcin. And that's it from me.
Thank you, Gilbert. Nick, can you go next?
Yeah, thanks, Marcin. Afternoon, everybody. I'm Nick Johnson. I'm the Chief Strategy and Impact Officer at the Cell and Gene Therapy Catapult. So we're a different kind of organisation. So just a couple of words of introduction about that. The UK government has supported a number of organisations within its Catapult network, and we exist to try and create the right environment to translate inventions and research into hopefully productive economic growth. And those catapults span a range of areas that are quite diverse, from compound semiconductors to offshore renewables and a number of other areas. But we have the Cell and Gene Therapy Catapult within that, which is obviously what our remit and goal is. And so we function, we're supported by the government, as I say, to create that right environment for the progression and development of the cell and gene therapy industry in the UK. And my role is in terms of strategy and impact, to make sure that we make the right decisions and that we make the right investments with that government money to drive that impact. And straight away, we kind of get into the notion there of what does a patient mean, because we will look at the kind of interventions we might make that will support and create the right environment that people can get access to these innovative new products and ways of treating diseases that maybe sometimes in the absence of those cell and gene therapies, there aren't any other alternatives. Just a couple more words about my background, and then maybe talk about some of the things we do specifically. So my background prior to that was actually immediately in the Catapult network as well, in an organisation called CPI. And then prior to that, I've got about 25 years experience working on the supply side of pharmaceuticals. So working with a range of organisations that have helped to support large and small pharma with their development and manufacturing needs. So the Cell and Gene Therapy Catapult, we have this interesting remit to grow the industry, and our success is when we see the industry grow and begin to thrive in the UK. And obviously it's in and around, you know, the ultimate success of that is these treatments getting to patients. But we'd look at staging interventions that, for example, create the right environment in the UK, working with the regulators and organisations to allow clinical trials to progress. So is the right infrastructure and capability in place with these new therapies to drive products into clinical adoption? And then you can look at other aspects. I mean, I think it's interesting with cell and gene therapies because certainly in the autologous space, it's very intimate to the patient in terms of the product actually becomes something that's abstracted from them, but needs to go through this process to genetically modify it. So we look, for example, at technologies that allow that process to happen as quickly and as effectively as possible. Because we know and we see with some of our customers that there's actually a very intimate relationship with the people working on those products and the patients they've come from. And recognizing at the moment a lot of those are maybe salvage therapies that you know, the effective progression of that product and getting it to patient is literally the difference between life and death. So it's all very intimate with the patient from the outset. And then, you know, we'll go right through to working with organizations up to the NHS and through with NICE to make sure that the right economic arguments are made for these therapies, and obviously the benefits that relate to that patient that can last for a very long time, and making sure that those are understood and quantified and valued properly. And that within that healthcare provision service, again, these are very unusual. These aren't tablets or capsules. So making sure that the right structures and conversations and environments in place so that these products can get to patients. So we have this very interesting, quite broad remit to try and stage interventions to make all those things happen, ultimately with always the patient at the end of them.
Thank you, Nick. And last but not least, Sandy.
Thanks very much, Marcin. And it's great. We've got such a diversity of perspectives from rare diseases and cell and gene therapy. And I work in a very different area again. I work in vaccine development at the Jenner Institute in the University of Oxford. So the people who we're thinking about trying to help with our work and the people who are involved in our research are completely healthy volunteers rather than the highly involved expert patient groups who are so important in some other areas of drug development. My own background's clinical. I did some training as an infectious disease physician in the NHS and then moved to complete training as a pharmaceutical physician. Pre-pandemic, my day job was in early stage preclinical phase 1 and 2 development of novel rabies and malaria vaccines. So there, usually the patient, in inverted commas, interaction that I'd be having is with trial participants, and really what we're doing is trying to take innovation from the lab into its first test in healthy trial participants. Over the past year, though, I've had really quite a different role. I've been one of the 6 principal investigators leading the University of Oxford COVID vaccine program. And my role in that has been really very different from my day job and perhaps somewhat unusual for a physician. Just to give a little bit of context, the research groups within the GENER are perhaps a little bit like some small biotechs in that they're led by individuals like myself who take on a much more generalist role than would be the case in large pharma. So in my rabies vaccine program, I'd hit some problems with manufacturing, which I'd had to solve myself. And so I'd become the guy in the university with some knowledge of scalable manufacturing of adenovirus vectored vaccines, because we were using the same technology for rabies as we've subsequently used for COVID. And as a result of that, I've ended up designing and leading the program for scale up of manufacturing of the Oxford vaccine before AstraZeneca became involved and after the AstraZeneca partnership, working very closely with them. So that CMC work is quite far from the patient. And I personally haven't been leading on public engagement for our program, but I have had what I guess is a privilege of an inside view in a team which has been on a pretty extraordinary ride over the past year or so, and subject to really intense public and media scrutiny with regard to a product which is being deployed in millions of people, while knowledge about it has been evolving in real time, and there's been a need for ongoing communication about that. I think the other perhaps slightly different perspective, which I hope maybe I can bring to this panel, is of an academic with a special interest in global health, working in a market-driven drug development ecosystem. So usually what that means is, outside the pandemic, we in the Jenner Institute are trying to de-risk and get proof of concept on vaccines, things like a malaria vaccine, which maybe wouldn't be commercially viable until they'd reached a proof of concept stage, just get them to that point of commercial viability. The really unusual thing with COVID has been that we got way past commercial viability using public funding. We got to a position in which we as academics had really quite a strong negotiating position in out-licensing discussions. But both in that case and in the usual, more usual work we do on things like malaria, I think we're trying to some extent represent the interests of the public and get good public interest outcomes from the drug development we're working on. In the case of COVID, I think we were able to translate that into quite a radical deal to maximize UK and hopefully global public benefit from the product. Thanks.
Thank you, Sandy. So, I mean, we've got an excellent sort of diverse set of experiences here, but I, as we have lived over the last year, almost year and a half, in a reality of a raging pandemic, could I ask you, Sandy, to just explore a little bit more, what we had discussed the other day when we first talked, your perspective is quite different to some of the other colleagues here, in that you are looking at a patient in your vaccine programs, and but both malaria and more recently COVID brings a very different perspective on the patient and how we view the patient and how we see the challenges that face us in terms of interacting with the patient in a setting of a vaccine program. Would you like to take a few minutes to sort of explore this theme?
Yeah, I think that the differences in the vaccine field are really quite substantial, maybe from some of these other fields, to the extent almost that, you know, when I was asked to appear on this panel, I thought, hey, you know, I'm not quite sure. I can speak to this because we approach it very differently. So in the sort of, I guess, scoping phase, you know, what are we going to work on? The decision making, okay, we're going to try and develop a malaria vaccine. Well, that's really driven by a very clear unmet public health need. It's driven by the epidemiological data, clear economic justification. And to be frank, we're not going out and speaking to patient groups, do you want a malaria vaccine? We then, you know, as a further step along the road, as we enter clinical trials, we start to hit the issue which persists the whole way through vaccine development, which is around the acceptability of risk in studies and later use of a product in completely healthy people. And clearly the level of risk which is acceptable for vaccines is very, very low. And so that in trials contexts where that's important include, for example, at the moment in COVID, you know, can people still do trials of new candidate vaccines with unproven efficacy with placebo control groups in contexts maybe where there isn't yet widespread availability of the existing licensed vaccines, but everyone knows those licensed vaccines do exist, and maybe there's a strong public health justification for developing new candidates. Further issues obviously around particularly risk with pediatric participants in trials, and especially when children are the target groups for certain vaccines. And then also we have particular issues with human infection challenge studies, where a lot of really valuable information can be gained by vaccinating small groups of people and then deliberately exposing them to infection. And so there's clear, you know, ethical complexity there. It's sort of people's gut reaction often is that goes against the first do no harm, first expose healthy people to no risk. There's some real challenges there, and again, COVID has brought things in very clear focus. In that there has been pressure from young potential participants in human infection challenge studies who want this model to be set up, who want to have the right to participate and create knowledge on a purely altruistic basis, and have come into a degree of conflict with a much more conservative research establishment. So those are the sorts of issues we face in research. And then at the final, you know, the other end of the spectrum are the issues around public engagement with products which are already authorized or in widespread use. And I think there we've been on quite a steep learning curve in terms of trying to provide clarity and to be open and, you know, avoid, you know, there has been criticism from some people that some programs have not been sufficiently transparent, but then balancing that with other parts of the public who or the media who have said, oh well, it's premature to put out a press release about such and such. And also striking very difficult balances between providing enough information to explain a complexity versus, the fear that more detail being in the public domain is really just more substrate for misunderstanding.
No, thank you. So that's, I can see a number of interesting things developing here. Gilbert, I would like to invite you to share your thoughts around some of the controversies surrounding, vaccination and studies around COVID. And we talked about it the other day in terms of children versus adults, the issue of benefit risk.
Yes, Andy, I think you touched on a very important point. I think there is absolutely no doubt on the effects of vaccination in the elderly. In Germany, we have seen an 80% reduction in mortality, and I would dare to say that this is probably one of the most beneficial interactions that you might think of when preventing serious cause of the disease. And we interestingly have currently a dispute in Germany on whether it would be useful to vaccinate children below the age of 15. And we all know that the benefit perceived or received from a vaccination is the prevention of hospitalization, ICU admission, and serious causes. And I think I have read in one of the big newspapers in the UK that there were a total of 447 admissions to ICUs in the UK during the whole period. So it's a marginal benefit that children would receive. And my question clearly is, could we vaccinate children in the absence of an individual benefit? For me as a physician, I say that a patient who is receiving intervention must have an individual benefit, or at least the chance of an individual benefit, which I wouldn't see here. On the other hand, there is the public health perspective. This is what I tried to explain in my introduction. So we have a disrupt between the public health perspective, which is clearly the interruption of infectious strains by vaccination. And we all know that children are transmitting the virus, and they are an important source. I'm a father of 3 children. And when my kids went to the kindergarten, I had my regular flu season when the kids brought it back from the kindergarten. So the question I would like to raise here is, can we vaccinate children in the absence of an individual benefit? And if there is no benefit, any consideration about benefit risk is not really extremely useful.
Any thoughts on that from the panelists? Because it obviously touches on the wider topic of benefit risk in children, and some of you, and Nick and Wills, you're working in rare diseases where you face the issue of benefit risk in children.
I'm happy to speak very, very, very briefly to the vaccine specific aspects of that specific scenario that Gilbert outlined, and then maybe pass over to Wills and Nick to broaden out slightly, if that would work. I think Gilbert outlined very eloquently quite a difficult challenge, which other countries, the UK is facing just as much as Germany. I think it's important to realize that there are individual benefits other than prevention of hospitalization. Everybody knows that illness tends to be milder in children, but the infection can still be pretty unpleasant in children. Long COVID is increasingly well described in children as well. So I think that there is some expectation of benefit in children, and many childhood vaccines, actually the risk for the individual of being exposed to measles, for example, in the UK is pretty low. We already vaccinate people for mostly altruistic reasons against many things. There's also what I guess you could term as a near proximate benefit, approximate altruistic benefit, which Gilbert alluded to, which is, adolescents might be old enough to understand, well, actually they want to be protected in order to protect their parents, their grandparents from bringing home an infection. On the other side, though, there's very real harm to arising from rich societies vaccinating our 12 to 18-year-olds in terms of denying scarce products to others around the world. And many, and I perhaps would put myself in this bracket, find it, morally really quite challenging to think that we're vaccinating 12 or 13-year-olds while there remain an awful lot of unvaccinated 60, 70 plus year olds and health workers around the world.
Thank you, Sandy. So yes, should we broaden the discussion around the benefit, risks, and the decisions that we face in development of products that apply to sort of children and adolescents? And I would love to hear from Wilson and Nick, because obviously they have a very different perspective.
Mm-hmm. So Marcin, Nick, if you're happy for me to go first and have a stab at this. I think this is such an interesting perspective to hear from the vaccine side of our development ecosystem. Obviously, where we're looking at a rare genetic condition that in the case of OI is generally diagnosed rather early compared to other rare genetic diseases. It's progressive. So obviously the ability to impact as early as possible, ideally to prevent the progression such that we don't end up with the cumulative disease impact by the time someone reaches an adult. So therefore the whole target population, I would say, is very much early intervention and thus in the pediatric community. And in order to have that true partnership to understand the risk-benefit profile, we come up against exactly the situation that you were describing, Sandy, which is if you're talking to an adolescent, usually they're very clear, they understand, they own their disease, their condition. If we're talking to a parent of maybe a very recently diagnosed child, there's the shock, the emotion, all the understandable things that need to be gone through. So we're then on top of that asking that person to bring their child into a clinical trial in order to contribute to a future therapy. And I'm sure any parent listening to this can understand that that's an extremely complex set of considerations to go through. So from our perspective, the most important thing is to stay very, very close to the community, speaking with the parents who have the children, to understand what the most important manifestation of the condition is, such that we can really understand what would be the most important impact for a potential therapy to have. And structuring dialogue in a compliant and respectful way in order to address that pediatric population is something that we consider is core to our daily business. And then, of course, the second piece of that is to replicate a similar discussion with the adolescent and then adult community, because what the disease is doing before it's ravaged the body of a young child, what it's doing there is very different to the impact we may be able to have or the way the disease manifests in an adult population. And so again, having a very structured dialogue with the representatives from a patient community is critical to understand we have this thing in our hands. It has intrinsic mechanism of action. What can we use that mechanism of action so that it's no longer just an invention, but it becomes an innovation that adds value then to the children and then adds value to the adults. And those two may be two very different value propositions. And I believe it's incumbent on us to be listening and to structure that dialogue so that we're hearing directly from the community that we're seeking to serve.
Nick, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Marcin. Very, very interesting for me to listen to the conversation. And of course, us as an organisation, we're sort of one step removed from the patient relative to others on the call and what those organisations are trying to do. And I think, so just a couple of observations. Quite interesting to talk about patient when you talk about vaccines, because obviously you're not talking about somebody who has a condition, so are they a patient or not? But philosophical point for discussion. And obviously there you're talking about ostensibly preventative measures that might operate on a population level. And then we go to the other end of the spectrum where we talk about people who have a genetic abnormality that mean that they are almost certain in certain conditions to begin to suffer from a disease, or almost irrespective of what they do. So the choice is, do they wish to partake in some of these more sort of experimental approaches to trying to treat that. So I think there's a very interesting sort of overall conversation about what does patient mean. But I think what I do find, and we've found as an organisation, where these things meet is actually in the technology, because some of the technologies are quite similar, if you like, in terms of some of the new RNA-based vaccines versus some of the cell and gene therapy interventions. And we've actually, in the past, had concerns about what the public conversation might have been about cell and gene therapies as they become more prevalent, and whether there'd be the right level of understanding in that patient community, maybe the society more widely, as to whether they would adopt those things, or whether you'd have the conversation about genetically modified crops and whether that would creep in and stifle some of the thinking. But the COVID-19 pandemic has almost raised the level of conversation about some of these things, and we feel that overall that's actually been quite beneficial, because there seems to be a pretty positive swell of appreciation of what these technologies can do from a vaccination perspective, and we hope from a maybe be that generalized population who aren't patients yet, or the very specific people who might benefit from some of the current innovations in cell and gene therapies, that conversation is actually overall beneficial.
But I think several of you touch upon the sort of an overarching issue of communication with the patient, and that being extended to the family of children, right? And I think the COVID has brought into focus the communication channels with the wider public and patients individually, and how tricky that can sometimes be, in that how easy it is for misunderstanding or misconception to start living its own life and create quite a lot of confusion. On one hand, looking at COVID. On the other hand, if you look at diseases that may be impacting on the handful of patients, I guess the communication is equally important. It's on a different scale. But I would like to explore a little bit more, because obviously ultimately we have to do what is best for the patients, and we can't do it without having an appropriate channel of hearing their voice and actually appreciating what patients have in mind. Any thoughts, Nick, on that in the setting of what you do?
Well, again, we're one step removed from the patient, so we're not developers. But what we do is, as I've mentioned before, we have these interventions. We support something called the Advanced Therapy Treatment Centres in the UK, which are organisations where there's that engagement with the people who will administer and manage these treatments, and engaging the patients in those, and understanding the patient's views and what it means to potentially be a recipient of an advanced therapy, and what's required to get them to patients. So that's probably the best example we would have from our perspective of trying to orchestrate and drive and manage those conversations and indeed activities to make sure that engagement's there for the benefit of the patient.
And thank you. And Wills, I mean, your thoughts as the chief patient access person for Mereo.
Yeah.
How do you see that? And how do you see the challenges, and how do you see what are the things we could do better? Because ultimately it is for us reflecting on what we do and trying to improve the communication.
Yeah, so thank you. I think this is a really, really interesting question, and also what Nick's raised. In a rare disease setting, of course, very often, and certainly in OI, as mentioned, the patients are the experts in their condition, and also the patient communities are very well established very often, and also acknowledged as expert speaking partners with the regulators and the HTA bodies and the pricing and reimbursement authorities. So this is easy for us in the sense that we can go and have a well-structured, well-recognized expert body to speak with. So that from a company perspective is exceptionally good in this therapeutic area. One area you ask about where it could be done better, done well, I believe it's absolutely critical that this is never seen as a PR exercise. It needs to be absolutely genuine. And if you go and ask the question, be prepared to hear the answer and be prepared to act on the answer, or be ready to explain transparently why you're not able to do that. And that means that this also needs to come right from the very top of the company. It's everyone's responsibility, and it needs to come from the top. It's not just a matter of hiring one person that stands over there that takes care. This is an engagement that needs to weave through everything in the company. The second challenge of interacting with a well-recognized, well-established, acknowledged expert group, of course, is that several of the representatives will also be requested by the EMA, for example, or maybe the HTA or payer authorities. So as well as Mereo is speaking with this expert group, equally they're being asked to be present at the EMA meetings. And this immediately, from a public perspective, we talked about the media, could give rise to a perception of a conflict of interest. And in the rare disease space, this needs to be handled incredibly correctly. We were very fortunate. We approached Eurodis, the umbrella rare disease organization, and explained the situation we were in. We didn't want the EMA to lose their experts from conflict of interest, and we didn't want to miss the opportunity to speak. And Eurodis gave us some very clear guidelines of how practically to address this, what we could and could not do, or what we should and should not do. And that enabled us to interact in a very structured way to get the guidance to the company at the right level without conflicting the expert and the recognized experts at the European agency. So those were two areas that I think we had to pay very strong attention to, and I hope we'll be able to continue doing that in the right way.
Gilbert, any thoughts on that? And I would particularly like to, at some point, to go back to your comment about the identification of benefit and the PROs that
Whereas I'm sure, and you know that we are in agreement on the importance of the feedback and the impact of patient organizations, in particular patients, on the program. I'm a bit more conservative on the approval process. So I think designing a clinical program, however, getting an interpretation of the data in a regulatory context is a very difficult thing, because it not only conveys the expected benefit, but in particular the potential risks associated with the new treatment. And I think there is a very prominent example, which is an antisense oligonucleotide approved by the FDA in 2016, where the panel voted clearly against approval based on a surrogate that has not been validated with a marginal change over baseline. And 6 months later, the FDA approved the drug, and I recall some comments, I think it was in Nature Medicine, saying railroading the FDA was the topic, and the approval is a stark illustration of the challenges of balancing science with patient input in regulatory decisions. I think that's something that we always need to keep in mind. It may be an exception, it rarely occurs, it has occurred, and it has steered an enormous discussion, in particular with the responsible FDA offices, to understand what has happened here, how could this happen against any, I would say, evidence And you raised already the issue of conflicts of interest. I've seen it in different therapeutic areas, non-orphan areas, where patient organizations are basically fully financed by industry. On the one hand side, on the other hand side, patient organizations are suing reimbursers to pay most expensive treatments that just came up in order to get access to the drugs. The desire to get access to the drugs is very understandable. On the other hand, I think we clearly need here full transparency with regards to potential conflicts of interest.
You're absolutely right, Gilbert. And I think that was where Eurodis was really able to help us to understand exactly where the line should be drawn. We have our instinctive view, but really to make sure that we were keeping the bright white lines between the different things. I've heard over the years many times companies say, oh, we're all in the same boat. And I think I heard it expressed very much better by Eurodis and some of their members. We're not all in the same boat. We're in different boats. We may be sailing on the same river, but we are in different boats. And it's incumbent on the companies to always remember that, what the patient group's responsibility is, what the regulator's responsibility is, and what our responsibility is, and never to try and mix those up, because I think that creates situations which undermine trust in all of our work.
Right, thank you. I mean, this continues to be a really stimulating discussion. I was just wondering if you were to look ahead, and we discussed a lot of what is now and what's happening in our different lines of work. If we were to look ahead and think about the challenges that we think may come our way in the years to come, it would be really good for us to do that as a society, as the industry that is ultimately addressing the unmet medical need as we see it and evolve to see it. So I would welcome some comments on what you think are as your fields of cell and gene therapy and vaccination in different settings, be it global or sub-Saharan Africa, and anything in between. What is there anything that bubbles up to the surface for you from a patient-centric perspective, obviously, as that's the topic of our discussion, that you would like to bring to the table?
I would like to take that one, Marcin. We had a discussion about 2 years ago on orphan diseases and the medical need. There are approximately 4,000 orphan diseases. And if we assume that there are only 5,000 patients who suffer from orphan diseases per indication, we are talking about roughly 20 million patients. And if we are very optimistic and say the average treatment is 20K per treatment, we end up with a sum of 400 billion in order to serve all orphan diseases. So this is something basically, I would say, unaffordable, unless we just set different priorities in different areas, but that's a different discussion. And the conclusion, and for me, the conclusion is that for most of the orphan diseases, 90% monogenetic origin, we need affordable gene therapy. And I think there are some companies in the meantime who are going into the direction of affordable gene therapy so that we don't have to construct a new vector for every target, which is the business model, I would say, of 90% of small biotech startup companies working in the orphan space. It would certainly destroy a lot of very interesting activities, but on the other hand, it may enable us to really tackle orphan diseases, also from an economic point of view.
Thanks, Gilbert. Nick, Sandy, Wells, any thoughts on?
Just in terms of thinking about the future, Marcin, and just reading in the paper about this earlier on about sequencing genomes of newborns, and where does that take us? Because it almost fits in that space between vaccines where somebody's not going to get something where there's a very clear monogenetic abnormality where we know somebody's going to get a disease, and we will probably in the future end up in that space. And how do we morally navigate that? And again, it comes back to that philosophical conversation about who's the patient, are they a patient, and might we need to intervene? So I think that day is coming pretty quickly, and there are some pretty hard questions that we'll need to ask ourselves and think about the answers that we come up with them. And is it right and proper to intervene, and what do those interventions look like? And then the other thing is actually from a cell and gene therapy perspective, as they might become more applicable to broader indications, and more complex indications, what does that mean? Both from an affordability perspective, but also from, is that the right thing to do for the types of conditions? So just a couple of thoughts to spur some conversation, maybe.
I'm not sure this is so much the future as now, but something that I thought of and perhaps relates also to the previous discussion about ways of interacting with user groups and potential users of products. I was really a social media Luddite before the pandemic, and a bit of a skeptic when people brought it up as potentially an important thing for us to be looking at. But the power of social media has really been brought home to me as a tool for communicating with really quite disparate audiences, because the potential users of vaccines, they're not generally in any sort of boat. In fact, the ones who have formed themselves into a group are perhaps the ones we don't necessarily want to engage with, and who've really made their mind up already. So for reaching a wide, albeit interested public audience, as well as experts in the field, as well as media, social media has been quite a powerful tool. I've found it much more useful than press releases, for example, for actually communicating detail. Although you only get 140 characters, you can actually get quite a lot across with some figures on a Twitter thread, for rebutting misconceptions as well, and also for setting the agenda and leading the discussion and getting discussions started. Because a lot of the time the experts who are picked up by the media and you see on the evening news, they're not always those who have the most expertise in the field, but they're those who the journalists saw doing a thread on the topic. So for me, more involvement in that space is going to be quite important in the future.
Wills.
Yeah, thank you. That was really interesting, Sandy. Mobilizing a community using social media, I think, I like you, am still a terrible Luddite, but certainly we've seen the power of that. Particularly when we're asking a community to help us if we don't have the answers. So we might be needing to develop a specific PRO, like Gilbert was saying, or to develop a real scientific understanding of the burden of disease. And most patients and people with the condition don't like that term, but sometimes we have to scientifically quantify that and start from scratch. Luckily, we're not involved in gene therapy. I don't know if that's lucky or unlucky, but we're not having to address some of the really important pieces that have been raised here. However, if we're asking a community to help us to understand a PRO and create one, to really understand what the intervention should look like, I also believe it's absolutely critical that we also have a long-term view and vision, exactly to Gilbert and the other colleagues here's point, of how are we going to make sure any resulting output, any resulting product actually makes it into the hands of the people who have helped us to generate that. Because otherwise the risk can be that we treat people as experimental animals, as opposed to guinea pigs, as opposed to really partnering. And so I think it's critical to have that long-term view, because people who have helped us, patients who are waiting, get very disappointed and very understandably frustrated if after all that work, they're faced with a wall and they never get access to the resulting innovation, not invention, but innovation that we're all seeking to create. So looking to the future, I believe it's also about creating those sustainable healthcare systems that also allow access in developed countries, the rich economies, but also what was alluded to before. What about people who are maybe wanting vaccines in other economies, or even rare disease patients in other economies, so that we don't end up with a two-tier system? If a person has a condition, they have a condition, and we want everyone to be able to have as uniform an access as possible. So for me, the long-term vision is also to make sure we're building sustainable access to innovation, no matter where that comes from.
And maybe, Gilbert, that links to what you said at the very beginning, is that you were puzzled by the lack of effort to actually involve patients in the selection of indications. I mean, given what you said about 4,000 rare diseases, and quite frequently we at tranScrip are faced with clients who come to us with certain preclinical compounds where, especially in autoimmune diseases, you could imagine 20 different indications, right? So, and what we do is we do the due diligence and we kick the tires on the different indications, looking at them from a scientific perspective, but also from a strategic commercial perspective. I think what Gilbert is right, what is missing here is the patient in that early in development, when you've got a compound which you could use to treat a variety of conditions. We're not pulling patients in. We don't have a mechanism. There's no platform for it.
No, I entirely agree. I know that we have done the exercise very often in the past, but this is mainly driven by investors. So I think that is the disadvantage, and the interest of investors is obvious, but also understandable. On the other hand, what is probably required here is a very wealthy foundation that is channeling these kinds of interests, understanding the opportunities. We have been doing exercises where we were reutilizing drugs that had a negative benefit risk in broad populations, but that you can repurpose in orphan indications because you have a different benefit risk ratio. And that's precisely the point where independent organizations could come in and say, we are interested. I'm sure that once the idea is created, there will be capital. Capital can be attracted in order to fund the development. But clearly, we have absolutely no link in of the patients, no feedback by patient organizations. As I said, it's a minimum of 4,000 orphan diseases in Europe, so it will be very difficult to get a priority list or to see what is the highest priority and then to fit available mechanisms of action into the pathology of the disease. But I think that's something where we simply have to think. It became apparent to me when I looked at it. Very simple. I'm
being told that we are now running out of time with 2 minutes left. So I would like to wrap up quickly and thank you very much, all the panelists for this discussion. I hope we have addressed the topic and that it was of interest to the audience. We touched on a number of aspects and considerations. So thank you very much, everyone. And I think we're going to, I'm going to hand over to Alicia.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Marcin, and the panelists for sharing your thoughts on this very important topic. If I may, just for me, what really shines through is that it's the individuality, of the patients, which is really important to consider. So also communication is critical. So whether that be via direct to patient groups, via social, to the general public on a global scale, you've really helped to highlight that that's a critical factor as well. But also because you're all coming from different perspectives and backgrounds, it really does highlight it's quite a complicated subject, which there's more to discuss on. So with that, it's my job to end this session. And just to say now that we'll thank our panelists once again. We'll now be moving into a 5-minute break, and then I'll be back at 5 minutes after 2 to introduce our Biotech Rising Star Showcase. So I'll see you in 5. Many thanks.